Good morning, everybody, and a very warm welcome to our webinar today, a new and transformational approach to contact centre hiring. My name is Claire Ramatala. I'm Director of Marketing at SOVA, and I'll be joining and chairing the panel discussion shortly. Just before we get started, a few points of housekeeping. Looking to sort of work through the webinar content for about the sort of 45 minutes. We are recording that session, and we're going to make that available to everybody, including the slides. At any time during the webinar, please feel free to submit a question for the panel using the chat functionality. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Alan. We'll just start with a sort of introduction to SOVA.
Thank you very much, Claire. So if we move forward a slide, if that's okay.
Yep.
Great. Yeah. So firstly, just introducing myself. So I'm founder and CEO at SOVA. In my experiences in developing scientifically led assessment tools for the hiring and development of people. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes just to give you a little bit of background about the approach around that, because it'll sort of set the context for the panel discussion we're about to have. So what we tend to get focused on is bringing together the science of how to assess people and understand what good looks like in a measurable manner, and bringing that together with digital technology so we can drive efficiency and better hiring, essentially. Okay. Yeah, we can go forward one.
Yes.
Does that move forward, Claire, at your end? Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, it's taking a few seconds to come through. So just a brief illustration of some of the organisations we work with, their contact centre operations, so including, you know, high volume hiring in places like Santander and Royal Sun Alliance and the like. Our platform actually covers a whole range of things. We won't spend much time on that now, but it includes assessments for screening and selecting people, video interview capability for the final stages of selection, and also where people are running assessment centres, there are tools for scheduling in running assessment centres virtually, as well as follow-on feedback on how people are performing in roles. So there's a sort of wider range of what we cover, but just focusing in on the contact centre space specifically, if we look at that, move forward one. Yeah, and looking at the contact centre solutions that we're involved in, typically we have situations where, you know, organisations have a lot of people applying. We'll come on to, you know, the context at the moment and what that looks like. But it's trying to put in place a scientific process for doing as accurate as possible selection of who high performers are going to be in role, so that we know that they're going to stick. You know, we'll be able to retain them and they'll do a good job and hit the ground running quickly. And typically that might look like a kind of candidate landing process where we assess the key elements of the person that matter for driving that. That can be around their personality, some of their abilities, how they apply judgment to different customer situations, but in a fast and efficient way. That may then include video interviewing or virtual assessment, you know, person to person at the end to select who you want, and automated reporting and feedback for individuals. So what we're really focused on here is putting in that kind of efficient process that gets to the best outcomes, which if we move forward one. Yeah. And in terms of the outcomes that we are seeking to achieve, essentially recruiting in contact centres clearly uses up lots of time for hiring managers. And what we're focused on here is if we can improve the accuracy of how we assess and hire people, and we can do that in a way which is fair and is getting the diversity sides of that working really well, that creates the opportunity to do that accurately and eliminate bias, but then actually save a lot of time. So if we can make sure that the people that get through to the sort of final hiring manager selection stage are of the highest quality from our candidate pool, then we can save, typically 30, even 40% of time and labour for hiring managers in terms of how much time they spend sifting CVs, interviewing, etc. So really transforming that process. So to give you an idea of what that can look like. So just wanted to briefly share what SOVA does to make sure that's sort of clear for everybody. If we move on to what we're seeing happening in the market, just briefly, there are a number of kind of themes, and we'll unpack all of this very shortly in the panel, but just to set the scene here. So one of them is very obviously in the last few months, we've had a huge rise in remote working. I think Barry and Michael sort of, talk in further depth about what that's looking like operationally in contact centres, but clearly building in remote working into how contact centres operate has been a really big influence. And a key issue here is how do we know what good looks like when we're hiring people to work in that way? What a high performance look like? How do we make sure we understand that success profile? Secondly, managing the even higher volume of applicants, perhaps less roles, and doing that quickly and efficiently is obviously vital. And there's a third point here around how do we ramp successfully for peak demand at different times of year, which, in different industries, that will vary, but that's obviously key as well to enable that to happen efficiently. So I just wanted to briefly share a bit of background about, the way that we can approach this, the way that we can bring sort of a scientific approach to bear to make it a lot more efficient, and some of the key points just to get us going. And if we move forward to getting started on the panel, and I'll ask Mike and Barry if they would to introduce themselves as well as we get started.
Yep. So thanks, Alan. So Mike Smith, I'm Chief Operating Officer for TMAC, the modular analytics company. I have been in the contact centre industry for about 20 odd years. Barry.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Barry. I am one of the directors of CCA Recruitment. We are a specialist recruitment consultancy in the contact centre industry. And we must have kicked off similar time to you join the industry, Mike. We've been doing this now for 20 plus years. So.
Thank you very much, guys. I'll pass over to Claire, who's going to facilitate the panel today.
Yeah, and try and keep us on time, I think. So let's kick off with the first question. Obviously, clearly, it's a tumultuous year for every business and every sector that's been impacted by COVID. But interested to sort of hear about what do you think contact centres recruitment is going to look like in a post-COVID world, if and when we get there? That question to Mike, first of all.
Okay, yep. So I think post-COVID, we won't go back to fully on site. It'll become much more of a hybrid model. So we've got to think about recruiting for remote workers. What does that look like? Who can be good at that? We're definitely out of the honeymoon period now of everybody loved working from home, right? Everyone's got Zoom fatigue. Some people cope better than others. How do you identify those? And I think there'll be, and we'll probably talk more on this, but I think it opens up a range of who can work in a contact centre. So a much more diverse sort of talent pool, geographically, demographically, and also in terms of like the shift patterns and all of that type of stuff is opened right up post-COVID. Compared to sort of previously, it was on site, 20 to 25-year-olds, fully flexible shifts.
Yeah.
Barry will probably add to that, but that's my sort of starting point.
Yeah, I think you're spot on with your comments, Mike, about different businesses are going to take a different approach to how they go forward. I don't think we're going to move back to a fully on-site model. Certainly, last figures were 98% of contact centres in the UK had some home working facilities these days. But I do think that there is going to be a balance. Home working isn't for everyone. It is about being able to identify the traits and characteristics of what makes a high performer. Some of the things that we saw when this kicked off was that high performers who were office based didn't necessarily translate to high performers working at home. So I think recruitment is going to be very much focused on how you can identify the traits and the characteristics of high performance in both of those individual locations, and also for a blended approach as well. I think if I look at what was happening before COVID hit and how that's then accelerated certain things, I think as an industry, we're much more open to demographics, as Mike was talking about, the individuals coming into work in contact centres. But I also feel as well that there is a move to be open-minded to cross-sector working, but certainly much more than we have seen previously, where because the gastro industry has been pretty much closed down for the last 9 months, we've seen a lot more people moving across from that. But as I say, going back to pre-COVID, we saw organisations were much more focused on identifying candidates who could wow their customers, not necessarily other candidates who had the experience of working in contact centres previously. And there's lots of different environments where people can wow customers, and that for me is a great thing in the industry, is being open-minded to where those people come from.
Thank you. Lots to unpack there. Just going to come back to one of the areas that you mentioned, particularly around the remote working. What is it? What are you seeing then? Mike, you talked about some people are struggling on the remote working side, some people are not. Talk to me a little bit more about that. How does that manifest itself?
Sure. So I think if we go back to the beginning of COVID, the contact center industry previously hadn't really embraced remote working at all. There's a couple of organizations that specialized in it. Everybody else, if you mentioned it to the ops director, he'd nodded a bit and then had a bit of a thought about how difficult is that going to be with IT, compliance, people management, all of those things. The industry kind of had no choice but to embrace it. And for a bit, we was in a honeymoon period. It's all great, everyone's happy, and then the sort of reality started to hit. Right, so some people live in shared accommodation. They're both sleeping and working in the same room. Right, some people have, at the beginning of COVID, trying to look after their kids.
Yeah.
All of that, adds to sort of like a level of stress for the individual. Plus, then you've got big queues in some contact centres. Customers getting a little bit unhappy. Their sort of patience was good for a bit, but then ran out. And you're like sat at home without your team leader, without your support network, taking some potentially challenging calls, potentially the personality profile that thrives on the environment of being around people. And so that's what we've got to sort of work out, is who is this great for? Who does this suit? Who does this suit, both demographically and psychologically, and who actually really needs like a little bit more of a hybrid model or even a fully on-site model.
And Alan,
and
Alan, if I can bring you in there, just from a psychological perspective as well. I mean, obviously that this issue is something that people will be wrestling in multiple sectors around kind of suitability to work from home. Is there any sort of insight you can share on what that looks like?
I think on this topic, I think there's a couple of pieces kind of converging here. So one of them is, as Mike and Barry were saying, we've got the whole point about everybody's been thrown into it, and that environment in a sort of on-site contact center is a lot more kind of engaged in, probably if people are more sociable and enjoy being around people, etc., that works quite well for them. But you kind of got that shift to then being on your own. Clearly, there's a difference there in things like resilience, in sort of being self-starting, in initiating your own activity is really key, because you haven't got that kind of level of supervision that you might have. So it's quite a different feel to it. It's probably worth noting that we've been seeing that in some of the studies we've been doing anyway. So, for example, work we had done with Royal Sun Alliance on this topic, we found, a couple of years ago, that whilst the assumption was that the more sort of, let's say, extrovert, gregarious, contact center agent was the right fit, when you actually analyse it, people that are more focused on solving the problem straight away for the customer, and maybe not quite come across like that, are actually better at some of their roles, and that's evident in the data. So I think there's, we're sort of bumping up with reality in this situation, but some of that was already true. But alongside that, you've also got certainly some financial services organisations looking at how they can converge their workforce and go, we've got people that work in branches, we've got people that work in contact centres, can we kind of have a customer service job family that brings all this together? And the ability to work to, clear performance targets, but, pretty much self-driven, is a narrower set of personality characteristics than typical hiring has been. And I think that's where the sort of scientific focus on what do you need to be successful in these kind of roles, will start to really matter. Barry might want to add to that, but I think we're seeing all of those things converge in what the success profile looks like. Yeah,
and I think that's, if we just kind of think about how that role of the contact centre is evolving, and what does a good contact centre agent look like now, given sort of change and transformation that's happening pre-COVID. Barry, what are your thoughts?
I think resilience is one of the key aspects. There's so much change that's going on in an advisor's working life at this moment in time, and actually their roles are becoming more complex. A lot of organisations are removing more of the transactional inquiries by pushing them onto other channels. So actually, when a customer is phoning, a lot of the time the conversations are becoming about much tougher and complex reasons to call. So resilience comes into that as well. But just going back to my first comments, I think that ability to wow customers, and part of that is taking ownership, and agents can only take ownership if they're empowered to do so. But it comes down to them to want to step up and solve those customers' problems. And I think those are some of the key traits of individuals that we look for to be successful in contact centre roles.
And I thought your point was interesting earlier, Barry, around actually where you traditionally might sort of fish in a talent pool for talent for contact centres, but actually some of those things that you talked about in terms of resilience, wowing customers, they're in talent that's outside of a traditional sector. So that's something you see on the rise?
Yeah, absolutely. There's an example that I can give, which actually was a digital bank. And when they were setting up, their view was, yes, they needed to bring in some core traditional financial services contact centre experience, but they wanted to also balance that with just people that were fanatical about customers, and they didn't really mind where those people came from. So it was giving them a really good balance of individuals as they were setting up their contact centre. And I mean, it creates some challenges, don't get me wrong, to be able to select and screen those, because you can't base it on CV. So actually you're having to think laterally about how you do identify and select those individuals to progress.
And Mike, I'll just bring you in there. Sort of what's your insight on that, and thinking about whether organisations are equipped with the right tools to sort of select and identify people.
Yes, Barry's point's a good one, right? So there was a meme going around probably a few months ago. Who drove your digital transformation? Was it your COO, your CIO, or COVID-19, right? So COVID-19 has driven a lot of digital transformation. It was the direction the industry was going in anyway. And what that means is that, to Barry's point, the jobs become more complex. And I guess what that then means is that you've really got to recruit the right people and control your attrition. If you're going to have high attrition, getting people to the competence to deliver great customer service on complex queries is going to be tricky. So it becomes more important than ever to get the right profile of people, and the people who are, able to absorb that level of knowledge, be able to deal with that level of complexity, and have the resilience and the customer skills to do it. To Barry's point, it almost comes to customer skills before sector knowledge. You can train sector knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Chris has got an interesting point on the about an example from Purple Bricks on the Q&A. If you want to just look at that for a second, Claire.
Yeah, so thanks, Chris. So there's just sort of not so much of a question, but more of an observation. At Purple Bricks took the opportunity to shift to some permanent home working, moving from our contact centre staff employed in and around Solihull to now having 25% of my teams based across the UK, and this will grow as I get attrition. Our ability to change the hiring demographic and get local experience across the UK has been a game changer for us. Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah.
If I can just pick up on that, sorry, if that's okay. We've seen it not just in geographical terms as well, but what we have seen is some of our clients have wanted to bring their demographic of age closer to their customer age profiles. And actually, I know you've got your views on this, Mike, around micro shifting, and actually having home workers who can just log on for a couple of hours as they fit around other things scheduled, whether that be childcare or other elements, has really enabled those businesses to tap into a different age demographic, which is getting them great results with their customers. It's a utility. The typical kind of 18 to 28 profile doesn't necessarily have control of the household bills and those types of experiences. And that's just another way that home working has opened up different talent pools.
Yeah.
And Dal, just in terms of, Alan, from your perspective, given everything that we've said about what that kind of the evolving nature of the contact center agent, how well equipped then, what are the tools and processes that organizations are typically using, and where do you see them sort of where the greatest opportunities to improve?
Yeah, well, I think sort of, following what the guys were saying in from Chrissy's question, one of the sort of one-liners that I've heard from people running resourcing teams over the last few months has been a move to sort of talent first, location second kind of mindset about hiring, which I think Chrissy's questions from Purple Bricks very much speaks to. I think what we're going to kind of see is that some contact centres will be minded to kind of revert back into the having everyone in the office kind of position, and that would be able to be a natural place to bounce back to quite a lot, hopefully sort of with COVID vaccines and the rest of it. Others won't. And I think that it's pretty obvious if you have how many people are there within sort of driving distance of your contact centre versus 30 million working population in the UK. It's pretty obvious one talent pool is a lot bigger than the other. In finding the right personality type fit and styles fit for what you need is a lot easier when you've got more applicants. So that economics aspect, I think, is going to cut across into what the answer is to this. Anyway, we're seeing a lot more applicants. And I think Barry was picking up on it earlier. We're moving away from spending loads of time sifting CVs, spending loads of time doing lots of interviews, which are relatively limited in their sort of accuracy. Certainly, we see that statistically. To a digital process to sift a lot of candidates and say, well, of all the people that are interested in working with us, how do we quickly spot what looks like the cream of the crop, the final interview? Make that really efficient for hiring managers. I think that's where we're seeing the big win in terms of digitally transforming.
Yeah, and that issue of volume, again, just seeing like how many applicants are on the market, and the upside of that in terms of maybe more diversity in the talent pool, being able to draw on people from different sectors. Mike and Barry, interested in your thoughts then, because actually the challenge of that, of course, is how do you manage, have you got the tools and processes in place? How do you manage the volume? How do you manage that screening process, in that sort of at pace, at volume, not taking you away from your day jobs? In your experience, what does that look like?
So Barry's probably seen this from a slightly different angle than I have, right? So
yeah,
when I've been running contact centres, ramping for peak becomes almost, and Chris, who asked a question for Purple Bricks, and Max is on as well, and Kim, I think, who's on. have all felt this. It becomes all consuming to just hit the numbers you need to hit to ramp for a peak. And that historically has been a slightly different problem because you were a bit candidate short. Now you've got a lot of people you want to recruit and you're candidate heavy. So it's going to become really important you've got a great opportunity, right, to get almost a better set of candidates, but you've got to be able to select the right ones quickly. Yep.
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen a huge uplift in the volume of applicants that we receive per role, and being able to screen and select those candidates on their merits as opposed to kind of their experience is a really difficult thing. And I think if we were going back 2 years ago, you'd be looking at huge resourcing teams in warehouses in a certain location. Whereas now there's a lot more tools out there on the marketplace that allows you to segment elements of the candidate experience and digitize those, obviously, including into those selection tools like Sabre.
So Alan, I'm just going to sort of, because actually we're talking about the kind of challenges about how do you manage either complexity of role, the talent pool itself, just thinking about some of the maybe more legacy ways of hiring. As we kind of get into, what do you think are the main opportunities and drivers for that sort of improvement for organisations, whether that's kind of the cost efficiency or candidate experience, etc.?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of drivers, I think there are drivers that for many organisations were important, have been important for a while, and COVID has perhaps had an impact on amplifying them. But diversity and inclusion and candidate experience have been pretty key for most resourcing teams for a while anyway. For the last few years, and quite rightly so. And they're not things that people want to let go of, and that they continue to be important. So there's a kind of baseline there. But what we're seeing right now with the wider economic context and COVID context is a lot more applicants, and the sort of CV and interview-based approach to hiring was kind of already broken anyway. And I think everybody knows that the retention in contact centres is not where everybody would want it to be, and that's an obvious truth, really. So when you then increase the number of applicants even more, you kind of get to the point where this is becoming pretty overwhelming. And I think to Barry's point, that's where that situation kind of drives change, because you just cannot have that much hiring manager time and recruiter time getting absorbed into coping with the volume of people that are interested in a role. You need to kind of move from that to how can we do this much better? And I think that's what's driving the change. But the opportunity is really around stepping back a second and going, well, what does the profile for success look like now? And for all the reasons we've talked about, it's changing significantly. And to take stock of that, define that clearly for your organisation, and then build your digitized process around that, and be hugely more cost efficient about how you're running it and get better outcomes.
Yeah. Absolutely, kind of makes sense. And Barry, are you seeing how are you seeing organisations reacting to these challenges and the kind of solutions that they're putting in place?
Some are using a fairly basic element of either outsourcing some of this and increasing man hours, but I think there are a number of tools certainly that we work with a number of clients using technology to manage the end-to-end candidate experience. And within that, there is the ability to screen and select a large number of candidates very quickly using, whether it be psychometrics, whether it be keyword analysis, to actually go through and take out some of those man hours. I think the really important bit that Alan touched on there, though, is it's about maintaining quality. But for us, success is determined by not just the number of people that we place within our clients, but the length of time that those people are there. For us to help a client and reduce cost, it doesn't work unless we are reducing attrition and reducing that dropout rate by increasing quality. So it's balancing all of those elements to deliver a great customer or candidate experience, because again, they are organisations' customers. So it's balancing all of those things using technology and people.
Mike, interested in your perspective on that.
Yeah, so I mean it's a classic contact center problem, right? So, and this has gone on long before COVID boosted up the numbers of applicants. Half the time you've got your operational team leaders not with their teams because they're trying to recruit new people, all the while their teams are becoming less engaged because the team leaders aren't with them. Yep. So you've sort of got a bit of a vicious circle that you've got to try and break, right? To go, well, I want my team leaders with my teams. I want them coaching. I want them driving great engagement, even if it has to be virtually. And I want I want great recruitment, and I want great quality recruitment, right? So you've got to try and balance those things. Some people do it by just chucking more and more people at the recruitment team. Others will outsource it. But I think there's obviously a place for technology here, right? I've seen some quite brutal shortcuts used in the industry where but I think those shortcuts, so for example, we'd only take recommend a friends, right? If you're not already working here, you can recommend somebody. Otherwise, we'll just chuck your application out. That sort of shortcut is just going to get you what you've already got. And Alan will have his own views on how what that means for diversity as well. So I think that I have great sympathy for why they've done it, but there's got to be better. There's got to be a better answer, right? Of combining the use of technology and a bit more sort of like smart working to get to a good outcome where the team leaders are with their teams, but you can still recruit quality.
Yeah, and to your point there, Mike, about diversity, I mean, that's absolutely the case that, if those kind of approaches, or, we'll only look at people that have done X before or whatever it might be, those kind of shortcuts, they're very much unintended consequences. So it's a well-intended thing to be efficient, but you can really limit your pool to quite a small universe and indirectly end up discriminating pretty badly. People don't think of that when they're doing it, but as soon as you start narrowing it for expedience, you lose a lot of value very fast, as well as causing a lot of unfairness. Yeah.
And Alan, I just think, we're talking about this sort of slight tension between how technology can help in terms of process sifting, managing volume, and then sort of quality of hire. Can you just, and you touched on it before we got into the panel, just to maybe sort of walk through an example of what that could look like, of those two things working together really well to achieve those right outcomes?
Yeah, sure. In terms of so if we took sort of a practical example, taking some of the examples I mentioned, like Santander, like Royal Sun Alliance, where they've got quite high volume contact center hiring. If you can get the accuracy and fairness of your actual process of sifting and selecting candidates to work well, then what you find from that is that you can then make the other outcomes happen. So if that's working well, rather than sort of, let's say, 1 in 3 candidates that get seen at final interview being hired and being high quality enough, if you can get that funnel working, you can move that to sort of 1 in 2, or even till 60% of them are really good. So you're saving lots of time. You're only putting really good candidates through to the final stages. That's driving efficiency in your recruitment process. And if you're doing that right, you've got a wide, diverse talent pool, which then drives good fairness and diversity and inclusion. So you can get that right. You can have a pretty rapid, good candidate experience where it isn't long for somebody from showing an interest in getting hired. So that's great for the candidate. But in doing so, to Barry's point from earlier, you're maintaining that quality. You're hiring people that, will stick with the organisation. You get good retention. You get good performance quickly. And you don't need to compromise on those outcomes, but to achieve it, you need a bit of a step change in your approach to doing it.
Yeah, and presumably, Mike, you're nodding your head. You'd agree in terms of it's a more transformational approach in terms of thinking like how you're going to address this?
Yeah, I mean, I remember one of the board said to me once, "You're just recruiting attrition, right? You're just recruiting attrition. You know that the people you're recruiting are exactly the same people that leave at quite a fast rate out the back door."
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the opportunity now, right? Because there's technology that can help, and also the landscape's changed. There's more people in the market, and remote working, micro-shifting are all options now, which perhaps weren't before. So the opportunity now is to stop recruiting attrition, right?
Yeah, and I think, Mike, to that point, when you had local geographical hiring, it is a bit more limited. If you have a number of call centres all quite close to each other in a relatively limited labour market, which is certainly the case in some parts of the UK, for example. When you've got this wider reach, it creates that opportunity to change the game there, doesn't it, really?
It does, yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Before I kind of come towards the sort of last question, I really welcome any further questions from our attendees today. But before I sort of come to those questions, all of you, or to all the members of the panel, if you could share kind of one recommendation or learning with our audience today, what would it be? I'll go to Barry first for that one.
Put me on the spot. Thanks. Yeah. So I think looking at contact centres specifically as we are, it's for me being completely open-minded to individuals. I think I've been doing this long enough, and my experience came with a CV was kind of key to opening the door. I actually think nowadays having that open mind and approach to hiring around what can everyone bring, and assessing people on their strengths is probably the kind of key for me, is that open-mindedness. It does bring challenges, but being open-minded allows us to get some of the best people that we've got.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I put you on the spot there, didn't I? Mike, same question to you.
Yeah, okay. So I think it's potentially a similar answer, but my advice would be to be brave. The temptation, we're sitting in the middle of lockdown right now, but this will end, and the temptation will be to contract back to how we were with the legacy thinking. I think the opportunity is for us to be brave, take the best parts of what we've learned, and change industry.
Super, thank you. And Alan, from your perspective.
Yes. Well, I think probably linked to what I said earlier, and I hope it will resonate with what Barry and Mike were saying, that I think the opportunity here is to make a change where you don't need to kind of compromise. And I think there's a vicious circle that Mike described, the kind of hiring in creating attrition through hiring, which has often been the status quo. To break the cycle, it does need a different approach. And actually, that approach is there. It's available. It's working in lots of different places. Certainly what we're delivering with people we're working with. So the opportunity is there to do it, but it requires that commitment to kind of make a step change, because small incremental changes are not going to make the difference. If you try and fix the existing system, you're going to stay stuck there. So it's aim to make a real step change is probably the one thing to take away to do something about it.
Thank you. I think that's been a really, really wide-ranging and useful discussion. I think we've covered a huge amount of ground, from sort of drivers for change, what the talent profile looks like, how do you kind of bring together technology and science to help inform those kind of hiring decisions, how do you drive efficiency and cost savings. So just thank you to the panel for all your input. Could certainly carry on for longer. In summary then, just moving on a slide. Unless there are any sort of other questions from the panel members, as I mentioned at the beginning, we're recording the session, and we'll share a recording in the slide deck. Barry and Mike have very kindly agreed they'll sort of contribute to a content piece, which again we'll share with everybody. But of course, I appreciate that different organisations have different challenges, different scenarios. So please feel free to get in touch directly if you want to sort of talk through how you might avail of some of the kind of technology and assessment technologies that we can help them sort of working with clients at the moment to address some of these issues. But I will bring it to a close just with a very thank you again. Thank you to everybody for attending, and thank you to our panel members for your really useful contribution. It's been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Great.
Bye.